For what purpose is the gentleman from Maryland seek
Speaker,
recognition?
I ask unanimous consent to speak out of order for 1 minute for inquiring of the Majority Leader the schedule for the week to come. And Mr. Speaker, I make a point of order that the House is not in order.
The House is not in order. The House will come to order. Please take your conversations off the floor. Gentleman is recognized. Gentleman will suspend. The House will come to order. Please take your conversations off the floor. Recognized.
Mr. Speaker, the House is not in order.
The gentleman is correct. The gentleman will suspend. In the rear of the chamber, we'd ask that you take your conversations off the floor. Conversations off the floor. Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield to my friend, the Majority Leader, Mr. McCarthy from California. Yield, my friend.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, on Monday, no votes are expected in the House. On Tuesday, the House will meet at noon for morning hour and 2 p.m. for legislative business. Votes will be postponed until 6:30 p.m. On Wednesday and Thursday, the House will meet at 10 a.m. for morning hour and noon for legislative business. On Friday, the House will meet at 9 a.m. for legislative business. Last votes of the week are expected no later than 3 p.m. Mr. Speaker, the House will consider a number of suspensions next week, a complete list of which will be announced by close of business tomorrow. One worth highlighting is H.R. 4909, the Student Teacher Officers Stop School Violence Act, sponsored by former Sheriff Representative John Rutherford. Mr. Speaker, all members of this House were saddened and horrified by the tragic events in Parkland, Florida. Sheriff Rutherford's bill will provide local communities with critical resources to upgrade our schools and keep our children safe. I look forward to the House speaking with one bipartisan voice next week and passing this important bill without delay. Mr. Speaker, the House will also consider several bills from the Financial Services Committee. This includes 2 bills sponsored by Representative Scott Tipton, H.R. 1116, the Taylor Act, and H.R. 4545, the Financial Institutions Examination Fairness Act, as well as H.R. 4263, the Regulation A+ Improvement Act, sponsored by Representative Tom MacArthur. Taken together, these bills will continue House Republicans' work to create an economic environment that is both pro-competition and smart and balanced in its regulatory approach. Now finally, Mr. Speaker, additional legislative items are possible, including potential legislation making further appropriations for FY 2018. I'll be sure to inform all members as soon as any additional items are added to our schedule. With that, I thank my friend and yield back.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the Majority Leader for that information. Mr. Speaker, the House is not in order.
Gentleman is
correct. I'm not going to proceed until it is.
Gentleman is correct. The members in the rear of the chamber, we'd ask that you take your conversations off the floor. Members on the side of the chamber, we'd ask you to take your conversations off the floor. Ask the House be brought to order. The House will be in order. House will be in order. Those who are engaged in conversation, we'd ask you to leave the House floor, please. Let me proceed.
I thank the gentleman, and I thank the Majority Leader, Mr. Speaker, for the information he has given us. Mr. Speaker, throughout the last year, we have continually run up against deadlines on how we were going to keep the government of the United States operating properly. The omnibus is currently being discussed. That omnibus was the caps which made possible, the negotiations for the omnibus were made possible by the fact that Democrats, a significant number of Democrats voted for it, while a significant number of Republicans voted against it. It was a bipartisan statement that proceeding. That omnibus needs to be passed by March 23rd. We are not scheduled, as schedule reflects, to be here, Mr. Speaker, on March 23rd. So that does not mean we might not go over, but it means that it needs to pass the House and the Senate and be sent to the President prior to or on March 22nd. Negotiations are unfortunately not proceeding as effectively as I would hope they would. We're hopeful that there will be a clean bill without any riders from either side that would lead either side to oppose that bill. Mr. Speaker, let me talk about an issue. First of all, let me say that we have, the leader has announced a number of bills for consideration next week. I venture to say that an extraordinarily infinitesimal amount of the American people have any ideas what those bills do or are urging those bills to be passed. I do not mean they are without substance. I mean that they are not the issues on the mind of the American people. This is the people's house. The Speaker, Mr. Speaker, appeared on television on a town hall on CNN some 14 months ago. He made a promise at a CNN town hall to a dreamer that asked him a question. House Speaker Paul Ryan strongly suggested to that young woman that, and I quote, revocation on protection for the dreamers brought here as children will not be carried out. Notwithstanding that, the President of the United States put that dreamer and hundreds of thousands of other dreamers, indeed close to 2 million dreamers, at risk by withdrawing their protections, which Speaker Ryan indicated would not happen. Quote, will not be carried out. That was some 6 months ago, Mr. Speaker. Not the CNN, that was 14 months ago. I have talked to the Speaker, and I have brought it up continuously on this floor. And I've been told by the Republican leadership, don't worry, we've got until March 5th to do something. I was told that in October. I was told it in November. I was told it in December. I was told it in January. I was told it in February. Don't worry, we've got until March 5th. March 5th came and went. No action. None. That dreamer to whom the Speaker spoke is still at risk, still worried, still twisting in the wind. 86% of the American public, Mr. Speaker, says that young woman should not be kicked out of the country that she knows. Brought here as a child, went to elementary school, middle school, high school, some to college, some practicing medicine, some practicing law, some being social workers, many being teachers. I was told, don't worry. They were told, don't worry. March 5th is a long way away. It has come and gone. And we're told this week we will consider H.R. 1116, the Taylor Act. I'm not sure that any of my constituents have talked to me about the Taylor Act. H.R. 4263, Regulation A Plus Improvement Act. I doubt that a single one of my constituents has talked to me about that act. They are fillers, Mr. Speaker. They are fillers while we fiddle, while Rome burns. I have asked, Leader Pelosi has asked, frankly, leaders of the Catholic Church and other denominations have asked, put the Dreamer bill on the floor in the people's house. The Speaker of this House, when he became Speaker, said, we will not duck the tough issues. We will take them head on. Don't worry. We got till March 5th. March 5th is behind us. And we consider these bills, which I think are filler bills, and controversial bills at that. We have asked, Mr. Speaker, that the majority party put on the floor 3 bills on an issue of vital importance to the American people, that every American knows about, that the people's house ought to have the right to speak on and express the views of the American people and establish policy they support. 86% of them. So I would again ask the Majority Leader, Mr. Speaker, to put the DREAM Act on the floor, to put Mr. Goodlatte's bill on the floor, to put the bipartisan bill sponsored by Mr. Hurd of Texas and Mr. Aguilar of California, put them on the floor. Take the issues. I know they're tough. The Speaker said you want to take the issues head on, Mr. Speaker, not duck. Show some political courage. And not only that, respect this institution and every member in it who wants to express their opinion on this legislation of critical importance to at least 1.8 million Americans. Vital to their future, to their life. And 86% of Americans believe they ought to be protected, just as Speaker Ryan pledged they would be 14 months ago when he said revocation of protection for the Dreamers brought here as children will not be carried out. Mr. Speaker, that bill ought to be brought to the floor to carry out that representation and that assurance. I've been patient. I've talked. I've worked. I've come to meetings. I met with the President of the United States, Mr. Speaker, with my colleague and friend, the Majority Leader, and Mr. Durbin, and others. 25 of us sitting around the cabinet table, Mr. Speaker, when the President said, we'll take care of DACA. And he said, you send me a bill, I'll sign it, and I'll take the heat. He was not telling the truth, Mr. Speaker, because we had a bill called the Common Sense Crowd. About 25 United States senators brought a bill to the floor, and it took care of a couple of the things the President wanted to take care of. But it wasn't good enough for him. Notwithstanding the fact, he said, you send me a bill, you decide, i.e. the Congress, the co-equal branch of government, who now stands suppliant in the face of saying, we'll pass something only if the President will sign it. That's not what the framers meant, Mr. Speaker. We are a co-equal branch, not a subservient branch of the Congress of the United States or the government of the United States. Mr. Speaker, if we brought those 3 bills to the floor that I just referred to, the DREAM Act, co-sponsored by Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, a Republican, and Lucille Roybal Allard, a Democrat, and the Goodlatte bill to the floor, sponsored by the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, and a bipartisan bill sponsored by many Republicans and many Democrats, the Hurd, a Republican from Texas, and Mr. Aguilar, a Democrat from California. If we brought those bills to the floor, the problem is they know the Hurd-Aguilar bill would pass, which would reflect the views of 86% of the American people. No, Mr. Speaker, notwithstanding the fact that American people are overwhelmingly for that, we're going to be considering H.R. 1116, H.R. 4545, H.R. 4263. Ignoring that 1.8 million people, ignoring that promise that the Speaker made to that young woman that she would be protected. Speakers told me over and over again, oh, I want to do this, I want to do that, I'm going to have some task force, I'm going to do this, that, and the other. March 5th, that's come and gone. Nothing's happened. I used to be the majority leader. I could bring a bill to the floor. If I said something was going to happen, I tried to make sure it happened. If I sound angry, it is because I am angry. If I sound frustrated, it's because I am frustrated. The People's House ought to be given the opportunity to express the will of the American people on this issue. There's another issue, and we do have a bill, the so-called Rutherford bill, that we're bringing to the floor on suspension. We're probably all going to vote for the Rutherford bill. But we're going to ignore a bill, as we've been ignoring for years under Republican leadership, a bill that is even supported even more than the DACA, Dreamer bills. And that is comprehensive background checks, which clearly will save lives, which will close the loopholes, which will make sure that those with criminal records don't get guns, make sure that those with mental health issues don't get guns, will make sure that terrorists who can't fly on airplanes can't get guns. Mr. Speaker, we have been urging and pleading for that bill to be brought to the floor over and over and over again. The National Rifle Association is not for that bill. I can't understand why. Rather, we bring a bill to the floor that will help schools. I think that's positive. Do what they can do right now. Should we help them? Of course. But we ought not to pretend that we are doing something to make our children safer in their schools, to make concert goers safer at their concerts, to make churchgoers safer in their church, to make people who go to a nightclub safer in that nightclub, to make people who go to shopping centers safer in those shopping. We ought not to pretend that the Rutherford bill is going to do that. Will comprehensive background checks do it all? It will not. There are other things I think ought to be done. But at minimum, the American people think that we ought to make sure that everybody who purchases a weapon has a background check to make sure that they're not a criminal, somebody with a substantial mental health problem that makes them unsafe to own a gun. Spousal abusers. Mr. Speaker, the bills we're going to consider next week, I'm sure have some merit from some perception, from somebody's perception. But the two bills that I've just discussed are on the minds of the American people. And millions are at risk if we do not pass legislation dealing with that issue. I do not criticize the Rutherford bill. But it will not solve the problem, and everybody knows it will not solve the problem. Nor, frankly, will universal background checks in and of itself solve the problems. But experts say it will save thousands of lives over time. It would have saved lives in Charleston, South Carolina. 9 people killed in Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, South Carolina. Mr. Speaker, I like to work in a bipartisan way. But that requires respecting one another. My Republican friends wrote a book in which they were very critical of the way we ran the House because it wasn't open and transparent. I would ask them to reread that book. I've read it. My friend is smiling. In that book, they really wanted to change the way this House runs. Make it open, transparent, take the tough issues head on. That's what the Speaker said. Mr. Speaker, they're not taking the tough issues head on. They're hiding from the NRA. They're hiding from some of their hard-line people who want to kick people out of America, that want to take that lamp that the Statue of Liberty holds high and bring it down. Yes, I'm disappointed. Yes, I'm angry. Yes, I'm frustrated. I came to this body to express my opinion on the important issues confronting my country and trying to make it better. So, Mr. Speaker, I would plead with the Majority Leader to perhaps delay those 4 bills. Rutherford's going to be on suspension, won't take much time. Delay those 3 bills that a minuscule amount of Americans, there may be 100, there may be 200 Americans who will be concerned those bills aren't brought forward, and put on the floor the 3 bills I referred to, the DREAM Act, the Goodlatte bill, and the Hurd-Aguilar bill, and let the People's House express its opinion. That is not an unfair request. And let the background check, universal background check bill come to the floor. And let the House vote. I know that there's some Republicans don't want to vote on that bill because the public is so overwhelmingly for it, and they may upset the NRA. That's what this business is about, Mr. Speaker. Expressing openly and clearly what we think the policies of our country ought to be to make our public better, to make our country safer. So I would end on those 2 issues and yield to my friend, the Majority Leader.
Members are reminded to refrain from engaging in personalities toward the President. Chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Well, I thank the gentleman for yielding. I have great respect for the gentleman, and that was a lot of questions inside there, I believe. Out of my respect for the gentleman, I'm quite concerned that if you are fact-checked, you're going to get quite a few Pinocchios. So let me walk through first how you started the debate. You started the first question concerned about government funding to the 23rd. You then felt that work was not being done, and you used the phrase, and I may get it a little incorrect, but you said, we only were able to pass a budget agreement because of the majority of the Democrats and not the majority on the Republican side passing it.
Well, my friend, just for the correct, I said a significant number of Democrats voted for it, and a significant number of Republicans voted against it.
But I thank the gentleman. So I think it would just be helpful in record to actually state what the vote was. There was 167 Republicans who voted for that budget agreement, 67 who did not. There were 73 Democrats who voted for it, but the majority of Democrats, 119, voted against it, which you were in that group as well, voting against it. So from 1 point. So that's 71% of Republicans who voted for this budget agreement. And just to make the facts correct, your concern about the appropriation process, this House passed all 12 appropriation bills, unfortunately, and we did it on time, and we sent it over to the Senate. In the meantime, you shut the government down before we could ever get there. So I think history should actually play to facts. Yes, I'm concerned about the 23rd, but I'm pushing hard. I'd actually like to take those bills up next week. And as you know, being a member of appropriations as you were in the past, when you get to this point where we already have the numbers set, it's really what is called the four corners, the four leaders. Now the committees are all working through it. They're actually making great progress. There are a few things left to actually close out. I would like to get it done a week ahead of time, and I hope your side would as well. So let's walk through some others. First of all, I was a small business owner. The idea that having a bill on this floor that creates more jobs, that brings more access to capital, that goes to the equate of, Mr. Speaker, I heard from the other side, the leader, she thought crumbs were the idea of Americans getting $1,000 in bonus. That's about equal to what I'm hearing, and I'm offended by it. It is not insignificant that someone wants to create a job and have access to capital. You're wrong about that. Then you talk about our Speaker. Our Speaker has worked a great deal, and yes, he has kept his word. You were in that meeting with me when we were in the White House, and before we left in that bipartisan, bicameral meeting with the administration, we agreed to working on this issue in 4 areas. And we have had numerous meetings in my office with that as well. You also, I don't know, maybe you forgot to state, we are a rule of law nation. In doing so, that's why we are in this position we are today. Because there was a past executive branch that thought they were a legislative branch. And they did something that everyone would agree they do not have the power to do. So the current president said, move it to the legislative branch like it should be because there's court cases coming. In doing so, that's what we're working on. The courts have now come back giving further time. The Supreme Court has now given a timeline that wants to make sure the Ninth Circuit before there. So this gives us time to solve the problem. I am more concerned about solving a problem than just passing a bill for some political favor. I do not want to be back at this place in another 2 years with having kids sitting here that are questioning where they're going to go. I know you raised some issue about individuals. Not one person is in jeopardy that is registered within DACA. You have been in meetings where you've heard that from the Secretary of Homeland, where you heard that from the Chief of Staff to the President as well. The President even went further than talking about DACA to even making the point solving. But he also had 3 other pillars. As you know, we need a secure border. You also know the current law does not treat everybody equally who comes here illegally. So you're going to perpetuate the problem if you maintain the current law. Thirdly, the idea that we want to make sure the nuclear family is closer together sooner. You got a 30-year wait when someone wants to come in and petition a brother and sister. Why don't we help them able to bring their children and their spouses in together? That's one of the proposals as well. Then the whole concept of merit. Those are all common sense, I think could be bipartisan, and the sooner we solve that problem, we'll solve it for a long term. So on this side of the aisle, we want to get this job done long before the courts even have to act. I think that would be the proper thing to do. So yes, that's what we have been working upon. Now, another issue you brought up, when you brought up about guns. And you talked about this Congress. I first want to give you a few little facts. I appreciate you always mention my book, that's why I smile. We don't get any royalties from it, but the veterans do, so please mention it as much as you like. If I take, and let me just give you the numbers, Quorum does this. Some bright kids out of Harvard created a company, and it's all about data. There are more bills out of committee, 643 in this Congress, and there are more bills out of this House, 558, than any Congress in the last 25 years. And in that meantime, we also passed tax reform that hasn't done in 3 decades. I know some people on your side of the aisle refer to crumbs or Armageddon. But I will tell you, to those families out there that got an extra money, that are actually fixing their car, are actually paying their hospital bills? Or those 1.2 million people that just work at one company that now have a longer maternity leave? They don't think it's crumbs. And they don't think having a bill on the floor that let more people take a risk and create a small business is insignificant. Now let me talk to you about what we did action, because we believe background checks are important as well. Let me give you a little background. The background check is only as good as the database of what you have. Now, the National Instant Criminal Background Check System, referred to as NICS, database is currently administered by the FBI. If the NICS check indicates a person as being in prohibited category, the FBI will signal a deny on the firearm transfer. However, the NICS database is incomplete and outdated. For example, on November 5, 2017, a mass shooting occurred at the First Baptist Church in Sutherland Springs, Texas. Devin Patrick Kelly murdered 26 and injured 20 others. Kelly was prohibited by law from purchasing or processing firearms or ammunition due to a domestic violence conviction in a court-martial while in the United States Air Force. However, the Air Force failed to record the conviction in the FBI NICS database. That is why this House, this Congress, this majority acted. We put the fixed NICS bill in December. It is sitting in the Senate, which would strengthen our background check system and make it more accurate. It would require federal agencies to certify twice per year that they are uploading criminal records information to NICS, requiring agencies to establish an implementation plan to ensure maximum coordination and reporting of records. Now, you're on record to voting against that. We have another bill on the floor from a sheriff from former Jacksonville, Florida. He's looking at school violence. But let me walk you through that one. As I mentioned, Congress will vote next week on Stop School Violence Act. This bill is proudly supported by Sandy Hook Promise, who note that it will ensure that a million more schools will be trained in prevention and the lives will be saved. Now, this isn't the only thing we're doing. Just this week, we're having oversight. We took the Oversight Committee in this Congress and Judiciary Committee in this Congress this week and brought the FBI in, and they'll come back again. Because there's not one person in America who wants to see what happened in Florida to happen again. But let's walk through this situation, because I think it's important that we examine it, because we want to solve these problems. There were multiple red flags were raised to the FBI about the behavior of Nicholas Cruz. The very first red flag, on September 25th, 2017, a YouTube channel host took a snapshot of a comment under his video that said, "I am going to be a professional school shooter." He sent that comment to the West Virginia FBI Tip Center, where all tips are supposed to go, which deemed it a credible threat and opened an investigation. FBI agents searched for files on Nicholas Cruz, but they were unable to identify the individual and did not even reach out to YouTube in an attempt to recover records on Cruz. So on October 11th of 2017, the FBI formally closed the inquiry. That was one red flag, but that's not where it ended. A second red flag, on January 5th, 2018, a second tip came via a phone call to the FBI from a concerned family member. They described in detail problems with Cruz he was showing with regards to social media, cruelty to animals, school trouble, and dealing with a recent death in the family. When the FBI searched the database again for Nicholas Cruz, the previous tip popped up. However, despite the call from a family member, from a previous red flag, from a YouTube comment from the individual himself that he wanted to be a professional school shooter, they closed the investigation. The shooting happened on February 14th, 5 months after the first tip. This House has not stopped to act. This House acted in December. The background checks have to be fixed. Yep. That's why we passed it and put it into the Senate. That's why we're taking up more action now for the schools and adding that to what we already took up in this House. Those aren't insignificant. I believe there is a path forward. Just as we did all appropriations bills, just as we've been through numerous meetings when it comes to DACA, there's not one child in jeopardy today. The only jeopardy that we will have if we don't get together and solve the problem. We have narrowed it to 4 areas. You and I know what has been said in those meetings. You and I know where it's at. We can find compromise. We can solve this problem. But let's make a pledge to the American public that we don't do a bill for the sake of something politically. We create law that solves something. So we're not back here in a future Congress taking up the exact same issue, putting other people in jeopardy. That is my promise, and that's what I'll continue to work for. I yield back.
Mr. Speaker.
Excuse me, members are reminded to direct their remarks through the chair. The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, the Majority Leader talked about a lot of issues, one of which was NICS. What he didn't say was they put a poison pill in the next bill, which is why so many of us voted against it, on concealed carry. There's a disagreement on this House and that. We disagree, for the most part, on that provision. We don't think that makes America safer. There are differences of opinion on that. My suggestion to the Majority Leader is the Rutherford bill is on the floor. By unanimous consent, let's put the NICS bill without the poison pill in it in the Rutherford bill. I yield to my friend to see if he will be agreeable to doing that.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and that would be the same outcome that's already sitting in the Senate. The Senate has the fixed NICS bill now. We will add more to it. I hope you're just as frustrated with the Senate as I am. Why can they not pass something? I yield back.
Reclaiming my time, Mr. Leader. My question was, will you agree? You talked a lot about NICS and where it's failing and we can fix it. We agree with that. So what I'm asking you, you put the Rutherford bill on. I think most of us are going to vote for the Rutherford bill. Maybe all of us will vote for the Rutherford bill, which says let's help schools make themselves more safe. Why should anybody be opposed to that? What I say to you, you just spent a significant amount of time talking about how we can make the NICS process work better, but that many of us voted against it and it hasn't moved in the Senate. I guarantee you, I don't know that I can guarantee you, but my thinking is if you do the Rutherford bill and if you add in the NICS bill, not with concealed carry, but the NICS bill that you talk about in the Rutherford bill, I will work with you to get that past the United States Senate, and I think we'll be successful. My question to the Majority Leader, will you agree to a unanimous consent request to add the NICS bill into the Rutherford bill on the suspension calendar? I yield to my friend.
Through the chair. The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the gentleman yielding, but let me give the gentleman a few facts. There are 426 bills that have passed this House that sit over in the Senate. Of those 426, there's less than 10 that are partisan. The rest of them all have bipartisan votes. There are more than 200 votes on bills that sit over in that Senate that was passed here by voice unanimously. So I'm not one to do something politically just so somebody else feels better that now they can vote for something because they voted against it before. I'm for making law and saving children. So from this point, we're going to pass the Stop School Violence. We're going to send it to the Senate, just where they already have our fixed NICS bill over there. And let's have the Senate, and I'll take you up on this. Let's work together right now to get that bill back over here.
The answer is no, Mr. Speaker. The answer is no because we want to continue to have that on which we agree defeated by that on which we do not agree. That's the pattern. And when the gentleman says all those bipartisan bills, there were some, obviously, Democrats vote on many of those bills, I'm sure. Mr. Speaker, I didn't hear a word about a bill that has the majority support on the floor of the House of Representatives that I spoke about, and that's Herd Aguilar. Mr. Goodlatte, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, says if Goodlatte was put on the floor, it will lose 50, 60, 70 Republicans. Mr. Goodlatte said that. And that was passed out of the Judiciary Committee. Hasn't been brought to the floor because it would fail. Herd Aguilar, who has not been considered by the committee, but who has the majority of votes on this floor, that bill, has not been brought up. Just as the bill that passed the United States Senate 5 years ago to deal with so many of the problems that immigration confronts us with, including security at the border, 5 years has not been brought up. March 5th, nothing happened. Come and gone. And the majority leader spent a lot of time, Mr. Speaker, talking about things that are important, but were not on the subjects because he doesn't want to deal with the subject, Mr. Speaker. Apparently the Republicans don't want to deal with the subject, and they won't put it on the floor, and they are obstructing the will of the American people. And they are putting thousands and thousands and thousands of people at risk, and the majority leader, with all due respect, is wrong. All the DACA are not protected. And many of them are not signing up again because they're afraid their government will come after them. And they feel they were flim-flammed. And I disagree with the majority leader, Mr. Speaker. Many of us believe what the president did is absolutely legal. It is consistent with what Ronald Reagan did, with what George H.W. Bush did, with what Bill Clinton did, and what George W. Bush did. Every president, since I've been serving here, has modified immigration consistent with their executive authority. There was nothing mentioned about the quote of the Speaker that was clearly directed at this young woman to say that revocation of protections for the Dreamers brought here as children will not be carried out.
And where is she today?
Nobody can sign up for DACA protection now under the court order. Nobody. You can re-up, but you can't sign up. 1.8 million. The President of the United States, Mr. Speaker, sent a message down here, or he said, maybe tweeted it. They would agree to 1.8 million and a pathway to citizenship. Parentheses, if you agree with this, if you agree with that, if you agree with the other. That's not what was said at the White House, Mr. Speaker. I agree with the majority leader. He brought up some other points, said we need to discuss those. I agreed to discuss them. I didn't agree to them, nor did anybody else in that room. And the President of the United States, 25 members of the House and Senate sitting around the cabinet table said, are we agreed that we're going to solve the DACA? Not a single member demurred. Not a single member said no. Not a single one, Mr. Speaker. Yet we can't get that bill to the floor. And the majority leader says, oh, well, we're bringing up a bill that will create jobs, and I'm for doing that. And frankly, if we do that the week after or the week after that, frankly, I don't know the bills well enough to be speaking about them with much depth of information. It's about how they were voted on in committee, but my inkling is that the majority of Democrats, I don't know what's in there, in these bills, may well have voted against them. Most of those bills that come out of the committee are pretty partisan. But we didn't discuss the three bills that I brought up. The majority leader didn't mention them. They have bipartisan support on two, and one, the chairman of the committee admits, does not have the votes on this floor. He would get no Democratic votes, and he would lose a substantial number of Republican votes, and the majority leader knows that, Mr. Speaker. And then we talk about NICS. I want to fix NICS. I don't want concealed carry to be part of that. And I regret that the majority leader would not agree to let's fix NICS and put the Rutherford bill through. That would pass the Senate, but he's got a bill over there he knows won't pass the Senate. But maybe it makes a good talking point. Mr. Speaker, I don't know what we have to do. We've been waiting a long time. Not just the 6 months since September, waiting for March 5th to come and go. We've been waiting for a long time to have bills on the floor with open amendment process so we could, in fact, do the people's will on immigration and on protecting our students and our families and our citizens from the irresponsible use of guns. We're not against the responsible use of guns, and we believe the Second Amendment protects people on owning handguns and hunting guns, but the Supreme Court in the Heller decision said there are things that the community can do, there are things that the government can do to protect its people and to make sure that gun use within the framework of the Second Amendment is responsible. I don't know what we have to do, Mr. Speaker. I don't think anybody doubts that the Hurd-Aguilar bill has a majority of votes on this House. I would urge people to sign, if they believe in this issue, sign a discharge petition. They refused to bring the Export-Import Bank bill to the floor for a year and a half or 2 years. Some of the leadership weren't for it. Matter of fact, the two highest weren't for it. But 127 Republicans to 117 Republicans, they were for it. And over 300 votes were for it, and they would not bring it to the floor short of a discharge petition. That's not transparency, that's not openness, that's not taking the tough issues head on. That's obfuscating. That's undermining democracy in the people's house. The gentleman wants to respond. I'll yield to him. If not, I'll yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I actually have the same question. I don't know what we have to do. You know, we come here quite often to have these colloquies. They're supposed to just be for what's happening the next week. But we talk about more issues. For a long time I heard, what about the Children's Health Insurance Program? You know what? This House brought it up early. We tried to work through committee. Speaker knows that how many times I went on the other side. They wouldn't even let their committee work on it. So what did we do? We took the ideas that the Democrats had and we put in a bill, we passed it bipartisan, and they still said no. They didn't say no once. They said it numerous times to the Children's Health Insurance Program. And I sat here wondering, what more do we have to do? Disaster relief. I know, Mr. Speaker, the heart of the Minority Whip. We went together to Puerto Rico. We went together to the Virgin Islands. We went to Florida. What more do we have to do that we brought it to the floor and you still said no? But you know what? We still got it done. Government funding. You started this whole discussion about government funding. You misspoke and said it was because of the Democrats.
No, I didn't.
That we were able to make this plan. You said a majority of them, and it was not a majority. It was a minority.
I did not.
It was a majority of the House.
Mr. Speaker, I'm reclaiming my time. With all due respect, Mr. Speaker, I indicated to the leader what I said, and I knew what I said, and I know what the facts are. The Republicans could not pass that bill on their own. There were over 60 Republicans voted no on that bill, and they got 167. You may have given me 170.
71%.
Yeah, that is, Mr. Speaker, almost 50 short of passage. Mr. Speaker, I will tell you, when I was Majority Leader, we didn't get much help from the other side, and we always had 218 to pass what we wanted to pass on our side. 73 of our Democrats voted for it, which is why it passed. Not the majority, because the majority of us were so frustrated. Again, the Majority Leader has not spoken to the bills. He's spoken about what we have passed. And the CHIP bill, by the way, was brought up weeks after it expired. Authority expired. Weeks after it expired.
Well,
he says it was because of our committee. I will tell you, Mr. Speaker, we can't stop anything at committee. They have a majority on every committee and could bring a bill up tomorrow, the next hour, if they decide to do so.
May I ask the gentleman, are you stating that we brought CHIP up just weeks before it expired?
No, after.
After.
Yes, it expired on September 30th. You didn't bring it up until weeks after that.
With all due respect, I think you might want to ask your staff before you put that on record. With all due respect.
Well,
I'm not sure you are correct.
Well,
we brought it and passed this House months.
I have consulted with a staff person for whom you have great respect and affection, and she says that I'm right. Now, she's my staffer, so maybe she's somewhat biased. But I will tell you that we believe we're right on that. But that's not the point, Mr. Speaker. The point is not what we have done in the past, particularly what we've done, and we all for CHIP. That's not the point. The point is we have two critical pieces of legislation this House must address, and that the overwhelming majority of the American people think we ought to address and think we ought to pass and are for. And I don't mean 51% or 52%. I mean 86% of the people or more. It's not a close question. And rather than talking about, oh, well, we did this, we passed 5,950 bills. I'm not talking about those bills. I'm talking about bills we haven't brought to the floor, Mr. Speaker, that we haven't allowed the House to consider, that we have hundreds of thousands of kids, young people who we respect and who are our teachers, our doctors, our workers in our factories, making a difference, working in restaurants and hotels. I was with the Chamber of Commerce in Maryland just the other day, and 3 different CEOs came up to me and said, we've got DACA people working for us and doing an excellent job, and they are worried that they're going to be kicked out of the only country they know. But we talk about NICS and we talk about this, that, and the other. Bring those bills to the floor. That's what we're asking for. We want that respect. We want that respect for this institution. Mr. Speaker, I'm going to yield to the Majority Leader again, but it is those 2 bills that we believe would pass with significant majorities in this House. The 3 bills, and we can choose between them. We've offered the Queen of the Hill for the explanation of those who may be watching and not bored stiff. One of those 3 bills that I've mentioned, one a Republican bill, both other 2 bipartisan bills, the Ross-Layton-Roybal bill and the Hurd-Aguilar bill. Both of those bills are bipartisan. Certainly one of those will get a significant majority of this House. And I'm not denigrating the bills. I may or may not be for them that are on the schedule, but there are no issues that the country feels are more important right now than background checks, and no issue more timely than fixing, as the Speaker pledged to do 14 months ago, putting at risk that young woman and hundreds of thousands of other individuals in our country similarly situated. That's what we ought to be doing. Yield to my friend.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I know you reclaimed your time the time before, but let me finish what I was saying. With all due respect, what do we have to do?
It's true.
Yes, we have a fixed NICS sitting over in the Senate, and yes, we're going to add to it for school violence. We know that it does not have to be partisan, that the background check system is broken. Let's not make it partisan. Let's get it done. When it comes to the challenge for DACA, we're just down to 4 items. Border security. Not one person in here would probably argue against that. Now, I know my friend across the aisle, Mr. Speaker. I know his heart. He's a good man. He was, as he stated earlier, he was Majority Leader. They had the majority here. They had 60 votes over in the Senate. They had a lot of members in the Senate, and they had the presidency. Same problem at that time, too. They did not fix it. I don't want to be in that same place in the future. My commitment is to fixing this problem. So let's sit down. Let's talk about border security. But let's make sure our borders are actually secure. When I look back and people talk about that Gang of 8 bill, you put more money in there for border security than what's even being requested today. But people still, on the other side, say no, Mr. Speaker. But the other point, too, is why if somebody comes from Mexico or Canada and illegally comes across the border, why are they sent back to their country, but everybody else is not? Let's secure the border correctly. Then when it comes to really protecting the nuclear family, why don't we make it a little faster that you could have your children and your spouse with you? And you know what that would do? I think that would be everybody a little stronger. When it comes to the idea of coming to America, should it just be a luck of a lottery? Or should it be merit? I think merit is a fairer process for everybody's opportunity. Now, I don't think anybody out there that's listening or can hear this later would say those are partisan ideas. But when we sat in the White House and we discussed it, and we said, let's narrow it to those 4 items, I know the way our government is designed. It's not designed that one person gets all their way. It's based upon compromise. This city, our capital, was because of a compromise. Creator banking system, Alexander Hamilton, made this our capital. George Washington, our first president, never served here. He was sworn in on Wall Street in his second term in Philadelphia. As my good friend knows, Mr. Speaker, when a bill comes out of committee, it gets worked on, then it's brought to the floor. That's exactly what's happening with Goodlatte today. So we can bring something to the floor and pass that everybody hopefully can vote for. This Congress has acted on so many items, but so many times this year has felt like the election has never ended. I know the heart of many of the members on the other side. They wanted to vote for disaster relief. They were so frustrated that they shut the government down. You know what? We've all learned from that lesson before. They're not productive. I also watched people when they talked about health facilities. They wanted that funding, but they couldn't vote for it. Then they said the whole problem when we brought all 12 appropriation bills to the floor that they couldn't vote for them because they needed a budget agreement. They needed more money. So yeah, it took a long time to work that out because you want to hold that with other issues as well. Finally, after the shutdown, that was able to be broken apart. But when we finally got that budget agreement that really is negotiated with both sides, even the individual on the other side of the aisle, Mr. Speaker, came to the floor and said she was going to vote no, but she negotiated and wanted to tell how she got victories inside the bill. That's not compromise. You can't sit in a room and say, okay, I'll give here and you give there, and based upon the formation of our government, with the Senate as well, we come to an agreement. But maybe, Mr. Speaker, I don't know what goes in people's minds of why they wanted to be there. I'll make this promise to the American public. I'll stay in the room. I'll take the ups and downs. But at the end of the day, I want to solve a problem. I don't want a political bill. And I will tell you this, Mr. Speaker. I've been in the room many times with this president. He said this very floor. He went beyond DACA. For those in the American public must understand, that's a much higher number. And for him to find that compromise, he just asked for 3 other things. That doesn't mean we're going to get them all, but that does mean we could find compromise in those 3. Mr. Speaker, the one sad part, if we had this debate with the American public, they would find compromise with those 4 items. They'd probably find it very fast. They'd want their borders secure. They'd want the nuclear family closer together sooner. And they'd probably want to see some merit. So I know there's times here that we get heated. But the majority of bills that pass this floor are bipartisan. As I stated earlier, more than 200 of those more than 400 bills that are sitting in the Senate passed by voice, meaning all the Dems and all the Republicans. We're going to differ on some items, and that's right. I want you to keep your principles. But there is a window and there is an opportunity. And I know as the days get closer, the election will be sooner. But let's make a promise to one another. Let's keep that election on the outside. And let's find solutions in this side, in this House. And I yield back. Oh, I don't have the right. I yield back to you.
The leader spoke in a very calm and reasoned way, Mr. Speaker. I will do the same. As an aside, I will tell you the CHIP bill passed on November 3rd, over a month after its authorization expired. Mr. Speaker, the Majority Leader talks about coming to compromise. I went down to the White House. Mr. Durbin and I talked about whether we would go to the White House. We went to the White House out of respect for the presidency, out of a hope that the discussions that we had at the White House would lead to resolution of a serious issue threatening hundreds of thousands, indeed close to 2 million individuals who know America as their country and who 86% of Americans think ought to stay here in America. And in that meeting, Mr. Speaker, the President of the United States said, and he said it on television, so you don't have to take my word, there is a video record of what the President said. And what he said is we would take care of the DACA issue, consistent, Mr. Speaker, with what Speaker Ryan said to that young woman when he said that the revocation of protections for dreamers brought here as children will not be carried out. There was no parenthetical addition if we do X, Y, Z, A, B, C, D, W. There was no parenthetical phrase. It says, we will not put you at risk, young woman, and those similarly situated. And we have a bipartisan coalition on this floor, but the leader speaks about going into a room. If you want to have a pejorative, a back room, privately. And try to resolve issues unrelated, not directly related to the DACA protectees. They're here. The President said they ought to stay here. And the President made a representation, Mr. Speaker, that if we passed a bill, he would sign it. But as the Senate considered a compromise piece of legislation, agreed to by Republican senators and Democratic senators, just a few hours before it was brought to the floor, the President said he would veto it. That was not what he said on television in the White House, that he would take the heat, if heat there is, and sign the bill that we sent down. Now we have a Speaker of the House and a Majority Leader of the Senate that says we won't send something down
to the President unless he agrees to sign it. Meaning that the House and Senate will not act independently of the President's imprimatur. How sad a position it is that the People's House and the United States Senate have subjugated themselves to the President of the United States. I presume, Mr. Speaker, that prolonging this discussion apparently will make no difference. But, Mr. Speaker, our side of the aisle represents just short of 50%, maybe 48% of the American people. And, Mr. Speaker, we're saying, let us consider, let us have on this floor, not in a back room, not in somebody's office, not somewhere privately, on the House floor, the people's floor. Let us vote. Let the American people see who raises their hand, aye and nay, on propositions that have been worked on in committee, the Goodlatte bill, and for months between Republicans and Democrats. Bipartisan bills. Let the people speak through their representatives. Don't bottle it up in somebody's office. Let the people's House work its will. Have the courage to pursue that which you said you would do and take the tough issues head on, not duck them. Mr. Speaker, I would hope on behalf of those 86% of the American people that supports the Dreamers, and even more who support comprehensive background checks, that we have the ability to consider those bills and consider them next week. And I'm prepared to yield back the balance of my time. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that when the House adjourns today, it adjourn to meet at 10:30 a.m. tomorrow, and further, when the House adjourns on that day, it adjourn to meet on Tuesday, March 13, 2018, when it shall convene at noon for morning hour debate and 2 p.m. for legislative business.
Without objection, so ordered.